Everybody, and welcome to ACIR's webinar on Russian national identity and foreign policy. I see we are beginning this new year just as we ended the old year, continuing to hold our programs primarily virtually. There are, of course, advantages to that. Many people who are not able to join us for either our breakfast meetings at the Ansley Golf Club or luncheon meetings at the Capital City Club can fortunately join our webinars and hear from many of the diplomats and senior military leaders, business and men and women and scholars from around the globe. So very big welcome to all of you who are joining us for the first time from afar. And if you're interested, you can find more about our programs on our website at www.atlantacir.org. A special welcome to members of the Atlanta diplomatic community. It's a delight to have you with us today. From Estonia, we have Honorary Consul General Adu Alper. From Greece, we have the newly arrived Consul General Theodoros Demopoulos. Nice to have you with us. Great to see you join the community. From Israel, Alex Gandler. From Lebanon, Wasim Hojish. And from Monaco, Honorary Consul General Doug Hickman. And of course, a big welcome to all of our members who have joined us today, and a special welcome to you, Igor Zevelev, our speaker. The groundswell of opportunities for good relations with Russian Federation and the United States that had surfaced in the 1990s and early 2000s appears to be fading rapidly under the weight of what we consider a growing authoritarian regime in Moscow. Coupled with such actions as Russia's 2008 war with Georgia, its forceful taking in 2014 of the Crimea, extraterritorial assassinations, continuing military intervention in the Donbass region of Ukraine, cyber attacks on neighboring nations, cyber interference in election processes and the like. As a result, many of us Americans and people around the world are searching for what are the underlying causes of what appear to be the drivers of this type of Russian foreign policy. To help us in that search, we have with us today Dr. Igor Zevelev, a renowned scholar who will speak to us about the impact of how Russia sees itself and how that impacts Russian foreign policy. Dr. Zevelev, a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., was born in Tashkent, former USSR, and now capital of Uzbekistan. In 1956, when he was 10 years old, he moved to Moscow with his parents and sister. In 1978, he graduated from the Institute of Asian and African Countries at Moscow State University, where he majored in history and studied Burmese, Chinese, and English. He holds a Doctor of Sciences degree in political science from the Institute of International Relations and World Economy in Moscow, where he served as head of department until 1999. Among his many distinguished positions that he has held during his career, he has twice been invited to serve as professor of national security studies at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, once from 2000 to 2005, which is when he and I first met and worked together, and again in 2017 to 2019. Dr. Zevelev also has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and at the Center for Security and International Studies in Washington, D.C. from 2016 to 2017. He has taught at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in 2017 and served as the director of the Russia office at the MacArthur Foundation from 2008 to 2016. He has held visiting professorships at the University of Washington, the University of Berkeley, in California at Berkeley, Macalester College, and has published 5 books and numerous articles. His current research interests are in the fields of national security, national identity, nationalism, foreign policy, and Russian-American relations. Igor, it is our great pleasure to have you join us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. After this introduction, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. It's a real pleasure to see you, Bob, and all of you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I visited the United States for the first time in my life in 1989, and everyone had a very optimistic, forward-looking view of the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. And the conversations in Washington focused on the profound positive changes in Moscow and the breakthroughs in arms control, resolving regional conflicts, building collective security in Europe. In a naively optimistic view of the world was in the air. And it's a very different feeling today, as you, Bob, said. The current state of US-Russia relations is at the lowest point since the end of the Cold War, and there is zero trust between the two governments. And the reasons for that are viewed, of course, very differently in Washington and in Moscow. Today, I will talk about Russian perceptions and perspectives and about Russian foreign policy. A growing body of literature addresses the question, who is Mr. Putin really? And what is his end game? Academic and foreign policy makers have often interpreted a radical and dramatic shift in Russian policies in recent years as part of Putin's strategy to preserve his regime that was shaken first time by the protest in 2011, 2012, and is being shaken right now as we speak. From my perspective, understanding Vladimir Putin's personality and his domestic political goals is necessary, but not sufficient. It's essential to look at broader underlying trends, as you suggested, Bob, in your introduction. In 1991, not just the Soviet Union collapsed, but a centuries-old Russia empire disappeared from political maps. However, it has not disappeared from mental maps of many people in Russia. It was a deep national identity crisis in 1991, and it still lingers. And today I will talk about ideas that shape national identity and foreign policy in Russia. And in my remarks, I will try to analyze first the historic intellectual roots and key myths and narratives that inform the present-day Kremlin's worldview. I will identify 4 such narratives. I will come back to this in a moment. Second, I will talk about national identity in Russia's global strategy and foreign policy. So the question will be in the second part of my presentation is how those general ideas about history, about identity make their way to foreign policy making. And finally, in the third part of my remarks, I will outline the main objectives of the Kremlin's policies towards the United States. And throughout my talk, I will argue that Putin's policies are deeply rooted in history and tradition. And Putin operates in a very specific intellectual and political context and often gives voice to the elite consensus and public opinion on Russia's role in the world. And contrary to widespread belief, Putin does not shape national discourses, but national discourses shape Vladimir Putin. And that would make any attempts to redefine Russian national identity very difficult, though not entirely impossible for any Russian leader after Mr. Putin leaves the political scene. From my perspective, there are at least four big ideas in Russian intellectual history that have been adopted by the Kremlin as a foundation of its worldview and grand strategy. And these ideas were developed in four corresponding narratives. The first narrative is about continuity of Russian history and essential sameness of the country throughout 12 centuries. This narrative is about unchanging and unchangeable Russia. It's about an uninterrupted flow of Russian history from the time of Grand Prince Vladimir of late 10th, early 11th century to President Vladimir Putin. And it was very symbolic that a giant statue of Vladimir the Great was unveiled by Vladimir Putin next to the Kremlin 4 years ago. And at the opening ceremony, Putin called on Russians to unite to face external threats as his namesake did a millennium ago. And these threats, according to Putin, are essentially the same. And all of them come from the West. And this provision on continuity of Russian history even has made its way to the most recent Russian national security strategy. So it's not only the domain of historians and philosophers to discuss these issues, but even in important foreign policy and national security documents, there are constant references to continuity of Russian history and the task to preserve this unchanging and unchangeable Russia throughout history and throughout centuries. And the Kremlin constructs the perception that tactical foreign policy changes are possible, but the strategy is portrayed, is seen as predetermined by the country's past. And it's not the elite thinking only, and the general public sentiment is very similar. Of course, it changes, but if we look at the opinion polls, we will see that the sense of common history is the key in the present day Russian national identity. The Levada Center, the main independent non-governmental polling and sociological research organization, asked what was first thing that comes up when you think about your people. That was the question. And the majority of respondents, more than 50%, 53% actually, chose the answer, our past, our history. Not our future, but our past, our history. The second narrative, Russian exceptionalism. Not only Americans think of their country as exceptional, but Russians also have a self-styled feeling of exceptionalism. There is a narrative about unique Russia different from all other nations. Excuse me. And Russian intellectuals tend to define their distinctiveness in terms of civilization, with special set of values and attitudes, distinct spirituality and universalism. For at least 200 years, this exceptionalism with some messianic elements has been a very important part of Russian national identity. If you read diaries of Fyodor Dostoevsky, you see a lot of references to this narrative of Russian exceptionalism. And according to the Levada Center poll, I already mentioned this polling done. This is the best polling agency in Russia. 62% of respondents believe that Russians are a great nation has a special mission in the world history. And only 35% agreed with the statement that Russians are a nation as any other. It's very interesting that this perception is very different from what it used to be in early 90s, immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The same Levada Center poll at that time indicated that about 80% of Russians at that period of time thought that there was nothing unique about Russia. It was similar to other countries of the world. So the change is dramatic. And of course, the Kremlin plays the key role in this reconstructing effort in terms of Russian national identity. The third narrative I would like to talk about very briefly, because it is well known and there is a lot of literature on that, is Russia's interaction with Europe and later with the West as a whole. And this narrative has been absolutely central for national identity construction. It's very important that for centuries, Russians tend to think about their country in opposition to Europe as a whole, not to particular European peoples like Germans or French. Today, a work of 19th century historian and philosopher Nikolai Danilevsky, his works are very popular in Russia and propagated by the Kremlin. And the title of his main work, published in 1869, is Russia and Europe. And the title is very telling. It's not like Russia and Germany, Russia and France, it's Russia and Europe. So these two entities are of the same scale in Russian consciousness. And perception of Europe and later the West, this concept of the West replaced the concept of Europe in Russian thinking in the 20th century. Putin often refers to Europe and the West, but when he talks about Europe, he never talks about Europe as in terms of institutions or democratic values. He always terms in terms of its historic, notably Christian roots and Christian origin. And it's very important distinction. So Europe and the West, there is something uniting. There are some issues that unite Europe and Russia, and this is Christian foundation of both Western and Russian civilization. And sometimes Russia is portrayed by the Kremlin as a custodian of true Christian values in opposition to all these postmodernist liberal interpretations of European identity. I will come back briefly a little bit later to this issue. And finally, the fourth narrative is about post-Soviet space. It is viewed as a region where Russia has special interests because of geopolitical, economic, and cultural factors. And there is a strong belief that Russia has a special civilizational and spiritual mission on this territory. British historian Geoffrey Hosking once wrote that Britain had an empire, but Russia was an empire, and perhaps still is. political, historical, cultural, ethnic boundaries and subjective mental maps of many Russians are not the same. And there is a lot of confusion about the true boundaries of Russia. And in the public consciousness, these boundaries of Russia do not correspond to the official borders of the state named Russian Federation. So it's much bigger than that. As a result, after the Soviet collapse, Russians had a hard time to recognize the neighboring newly independent states, Ukraine and Belarus in particular, as separate nations. Putin has said many times that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people. It's not a very popular view in Ukraine today, of course. To conclude my discussion of the four big ideas, narratives, I would say that they have a very important impact on present-day Russian foreign policy, but these narratives I described rely on one particular trend, one particular school of thought in Russian national identity construction. The Kremlin always rely on the most conservative nationalist thinkers of the 19th, 20th centuries, and almost entirely ignores the rich liberal tradition, liberal intellectual legacy of Russian philosophers and thinkers like Pavel Milyukov in the early 20th century, or Dmitry Likhachev in the second half of the 20th century. They're not popular, and their legacy is downplayed by the Kremlin. So the four narratives that I described a moment ago rely on this conservative nationalist tradition in Russian thinking. And now I will turn to the Kremlin's global outlook and strategy. It's interesting that approximately until 2012, until the moment Putin came back to the Kremlin after 4 years of presidency of Anatoly Medvedev, this emphasis on Russian national identity became much more pronounced than during the first 2 terms of Vladimir Putin. And the reason the Kremlin turned to these historical narratives, national myths, philosophical legacy of Russian conservatives, the reason was that the mass protests in Russia in late 2011, 2012, and revolution in Ukraine in late 2013, early 2014, from Kremlin's perspective, allowed Moscow and even forced Moscow to securitize the question of identity. That is, to make it one of the issues critical for the survival of the Russian nation and statehood. And this in turn allowed Putin to justify, 2 years later, to justify the annexation of Crimea, not only in geopolitical terms, but also in spiritual terms of sacral meanings that are so important for national identity construction. Crimea was portrayed and presented to the Russian people as a cradle of Russian Christianity, where Christianity was adopted by Russian leaders of that time. And that's why it always played, according to the Kremlin, before 2014, not many Russians thought about Crimea in those terms, but the Kremlin constructed this narrative of reuniting with the cradle of Russian Christianity in Crimea. Russian foreign policy and national security apparatus is actually constrained by the Kremlin's version of Russian national identity, which dictates, this identity dictates what can and cannot be done on the international arena. It doesn't matter if individual foreign policy makers like foreign minister or anyone else sincerely believe in the four narratives I outlined in the beginning. What matters is that they have to develop and implement policies in a way that would not contradict these narratives. And they often refer to these narratives in their major foreign policy speeches and documents. So what are the main components of foreign policy thinking that is developing within the parameters set by historic narratives? The first, the ideas that shape Russian national identity when translated into foreign policy language often take the shape of the concept of Russia as a great power. This corresponds well with public sentiment. Again, according to Levada Center opinion polls, 88% of Russians believe that Russia should maintain the superpower or great power status. And about 75% of Russians believe that Russia is a great power today. And the Kremlin sees modern Russia as a unique great power with a mission. From this perspective, the country's international status and prestige may be achieved not only through military might, political influence, or traditional balance of power game on the international arena, but this is an entitlement predetermined by its spiritual and cultural status. And this, of course, is related, this concept of Russia as a great power is related to narratives of historic continuity and exceptionalism I talked about a moment earlier. The second component of Russian foreign policy thinking today is belief in that the West tries to change Russia's unique conservative national identity. That includes, according to the Kremlin, patriotism, traditional gender roles, Orthodox Christianity, the special role of Russian national leader, and that the West wants to deprive Russia of its uniqueness and tries to make it one more liberal democratic country. And the Kremlin believes that the West is meddling in Russian domestic affairs by supporting pro-Western liberal opposition to the Kremlin. And from the Kremlin perspective, the West actually has an ally within Russia. This is well-educated, urban, middle class in big Russian cities. And this alliance between the external power, the West, and internal constituency makes the Kremlin very, very nervous. The third component of Russian thinking is foreign policy thinking is that Russia is a natural dominant power on the post-Soviet space. The Kremlin views of the post-Soviet space are reflected in discourses in policies on protection of Russian compatriots residing in the so-called near abroad. This is the term applied by the Kremlin to the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union. In the concept of Ruski Mir, this is Russian world, which is bigger than the Russian Federation as a state, because about 25 million ethnic Russians found themselves outside the borders of the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And also there are many Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians who are also constituent parts of this Russian world as it is constructed by the Kremlin. The events in Ukraine, say in 2014, when corrupt President Yanukovych actually was toppled, was portrayed by the Kremlin as a coup organized by the West on the territory of the Russian world, because Ukraine is a part of this bigger Russian world, bigger than the Russian Federation. So these are just some thoughts about the major components of Russian policy thinking in the most general words. And in conclusion, I'd like to say just a little bit about the general ideas that shape the main objectives on the Kremlin's policies, specifically towards the United States. As I already said, Putin's main goal on the world arena is reasserting Russia as a great power and maintaining this status. And to achieve this goal, Putin says the following three objectives in Russia's relations with the United States. First, limiting the America's world leadership role. The Kremlin believes that an ideal world order would be one with great powers, each of which has spheres of interest where each great power dominates. So Russia as a great power has its own sphere of interest. This is, of course, first of all, the post-Soviet space in this vision of the world. And this world leader, this role of the United States talks about as leader of the world, contradicts this ideal worldview that exists in world order that exists in the heads of the Kremlin policymakers. So limiting America's world leadership role. Second, breaking the US monopoly over usage of its military power to achieve foreign policy goals. Demonstrating Russia's ability to project its military power well beyond its borders and even beyond this zone of influence in the post-Soviet space. From this perspective, we should look at the operation in Syria, which was designed by Russian foreign policymakers, not only as something which was designed not only to achieve concrete objectives in the Middle East, but this operation was viewed as a message to Washington and NATO. Yes, we can do it. We also can project power when military power, when we want to achieve certain political objectives in this or that region of the world. And finally, the third objective is stopping what the Kremlin sees as the American crusade to do regime changes around the world. So Russia pushed back in Ukraine and Syria. And last year, we saw the events in Belarus where there were mass protests against Alexander Lukashenko, a brutal dictator. We saw some events in Moldova where pro-European forces came to power. We saw unrest in Kyrgyzstan. All those events were presented by the Russian propaganda domestically as a result of the Western meddling and the Western attempts to do regime changes. So the mass protests in Belarus were portrayed as a result of this meddling by external forces, by the West, not as something domestic. So to conclude, I would like to emphasize that once again that Russian foreign policy doctrine stems more from domestic ideas about Russian identity, more than from existing conceptualization of the world order, which have developed in theory and practice of international relations. Of course, collective national identities do change over time. The Kremlin tries to persuade everyone inside Russia and outside Russia that Russian foreign policy style and tactics may change in the coming years, but the worldviews and strategic goals never change. Well, there are some grains of truth in it, in terms that national identities is not something you can easily change overnight, but they do change over time. And by the way, the polls show of the Russian public that they want to improve their relations with the West. And when asked, do you think that Russia needs to repair its relations with the United States and other Western countries, 75% respondents say yes. But it doesn't mean that the Russians are ready to give up their views. They want to normalize their relations with the West, but on their terms. Nevertheless, having said all that, I choose to be optimistic. And my optimistic moment in 1989, when I first visited Washington, took place in the wake of the seemingly hopeless years of the Cold War. And I think that successful positive changes in the US-Soviet relations at that time became possible only after profound domestic changes that had taken place in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev. So I expect a similar scenario in the coming years. It will not probably happen tomorrow, but in Russia, you have to live long to see a positive change. But who said that it would be easy? I'll stop here. Thank you. And I'm ready to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zevelev. We appreciate the perspectives you've brought to us. They're real eye-openers in many respects for those who have not really assiduously followed Russian history. So we're appreciative for that. Mike Story wants to clear the air with a question before we follow up on some of the specific points that you've laid out for us in the last 40 minutes. He asks, does the speaker feel any danger for what he says publicly that may come across as criticizing Putin or Russia?
No, I do not see any danger by speaking about my subject and at all. Russia is not a totalitarian state. It's an authoritarian state, definitely. It's non-democratic. FM radio, the internet, some mass media outlets remain free and very critical of the Kremlin. And as soon as people do not mobilize and organize people, they are relatively free to be very critical of the Kremlin. What the Kremlin is really afraid of, community organizers on the low level and of those who can organize protests on a national level, like Mr. Navalny, who is under arrest at this moment. No, I do not feel any danger for me at this moment.
T.C. Jasperson asks, So was the expansion of NATO post-1991 one of the key issues for Putin in terms of affecting how he governed internally and dealt with the rest of the world?
Well, NATO expansion is a very sensitive and very painful issue in Russia. And the Kremlin capitalizes on that. It uses this factor in justifying many of its policies, because the Kremlin policymakers know very well that the NATO expansion was not popular in Russia, to say the least. And even the most pro-Western liberal foreign policy thinkers and foreign policy makers in Russia were opposed to NATO expansion. In part, it was the legacy of broad vision of Mikhail Gorbachev in late years of the Soviet Union, which included this appeal to foreign policy makers around the world to get rid of the institutions of the Cold War, and NATO was perceived as one. So the factor of NATO, the impact of NATO expansion on thinking of many Russians is underestimated in the West, from my perspective. And many pro-Western Russian liberals became more nationalistic because of that, and migrated from this pro-Western liberal school of thought to more nationalistic school of thought. Today, there are two components that bother foreign policy makers. This is not so much the prospect of NATO enlargement, which is not on the table, with the exception of some countries in southwestern Europe and the Balkans, which do not bother Russia much, but its movement of permanent military infrastructure closer to the Russian borders, the deployment not only on rotational basis, but also on a permanent stationed US military in countries like Poland, and maybe in the future in the three Baltic states. That bothers Russian military planners and foreign policy makers.
From Colt Whittle, what is the best way to respond to a Russian cyber attack, Russian cyber espionage, or Russian propaganda operations?
Well, my understanding, there are several components in cyber attacks. One is information gathering. And according to former CIA director, Mr. Brennan, well, both the United States and Russia does it. You can hardly imagine the world when they stop it in the near future. This is one thing. But using this information to influence political process in a different country is another matter. So we must make a distinction, first of all, between hacking for the purposes of information collection and hacking for the purposes of influencing political purposes. I believe that some kind of political agreement between the two countries on halting such operations, not information gathering, from my perspective, it is impossible, but in terms of using this information to do political influence, this is something I think foreign policy makers of two countries can quietly, without much publicity, must open the door for dialogue in this sphere to put some freeze on such operations that bother very much citizens of both countries.
From John Romero, Given Russia's multinational and multi-ethnic character, especially with respect to its large Muslim population of Tatars, Bashkirs, Central Asians, and others, do you foresee the narratives related to Russia's Christian Orthodox identity becoming less important over time? Do you believe that Eurasianist thinking, as promoted by philosophers like Dugin, would become even more prominent in the future than they are today?
Well, the Kremlin tries to find a balance between supporting and promoting the ideas of Christian roots of Russian identity with rhetoric about multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious character of the Russian Federation today. Mr. Putin himself, though I'm very critical of many of his policies, in this area I must give some credit in terms that he's very careful in his rhetoric, and he often makes references to this Muslim component in Russian multi-ethnic culture. But at the same time, there are policymakers who are much less careful, who emphasize much more this Russian Orthodox component of Russian culture. Eurasianist ideas, are not as much popular in Russia as they were some time ago. Mr. Dugin is a well-known publicist and philosopher, an ideologue of the ideas of Eurasianism. His influence on the Kremlin policies, from my perspective, a little bit overestimated in the West. Among the contemporary philosophers, I think late Alexander Solzhenitsyn, his views are much more, influential, I would say, in Russia than Mr. Dugin's. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I consider him as a founder of the modern day Russian ethnic nationalism, which emphasizes this Russian ethnic roots as a foundation of Russian national identity. And by the way, Alexander Solzhenitsyn welcomed the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he said that the issue was that it collapsed along the wrong lines drawn by the Bolsheviks. And the right lines, the right boundaries from his perspective are ethnic boundaries. And from this perspective, Ukraine, Belarus, northern Kazakhstan, which he called southern Siberia, and northeastern part of Estonia should be part of Russia, while Chechnya is culturally alien, according to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and it should go independent. This kind of views, I'm afraid, would be more popular in Russia in the coming years, and they are very dangerous, by the way.
From Joseph Bankhoff. As one who has held joint classes with MGIMO, what is your assessment of the views and attitudes of the next generation of Russian students?
What generation, excuse me?
The next generation.
Next generation of the Russian students.
The upcoming.
There is, of course, a lot of research on the Russian youth. And many of this research indicates that two sets of ideas are very popular among younger Russians. The first is ideas of freedom, liberalism in classic European understanding of liberalism, and nationalism. And this blend of some kind of nationalism and classic European style liberalism is a very important political force in Russia. And the main Putin's critic today, and actually the leader of the Russian opposition, Alexei Navalny, who has become so well known around the world in recent months and today, his views probably reflect an attempt to blend these two trends, liberalism and nationalism. Of course, nationalism, well, is such a broad term that it may be very ugly and dangerous force, but at the same time, this may be a force of liberation, like it was when the Soviet Union collapsed in many parts of the former Soviet Union, like in the Baltic states, and in many countries on then Eastern Europe, which we call today Central Europe. This kind of civilized nationalism was also a part of liberation from the Soviet diktat. So the form the Russian nationalism will take in the coming years will determine the future of Russia and that part of the world.
The next question is from Consul General Theodoros Demopoulos. I would like to notice how the Kremlin uses the terms Ruski and Rossiyskaya, I'm not sure that is the appropriate pronunciation, when ready to protect and project its interests abroad, especially in the near abroad. To what extent do you believe this undermines cohesion within the multinational, multicultural Russian Federation?
It's a great question. Just a very brief note to those of you who do not speak Russian. In the Russian language, in the English language, there is one word to Russia, to Russian. In the Russian language, there are two words. Russian, that means ethnic Russian, and Российский, that means, which refers to citizens of Russia, to the civic nation of the Russian Federation. So you culturally may be a Muslim, but Российский, you may be Tatar or whoever, Japanese, but to be a Russian citizen, and the appropriate term would be Российский. But if you are ethnic Russian, which is also a subject of interpretation, what does it mean? You would be referred to as Русский. And the delicate balance between these two concepts is very important for Russian national identity and foreign policy. And thank you for this question, because it affects Russian policies in the post-Soviet space. The Kremlin under Putin tries to use more this civic understanding of Russianness. That means that the term Российский, that's what the Kremlin tries to propagate. But at the same time, there are certain ethnic components in modern day Russian ideology, which refers to this narrow understanding of Russians, which refers to ethnic roots of Russians. Until 2014, Putin himself avoided to use the word Русский in his public speeches or interviews. He always said Российский, referring to the civic understanding of Russianness based on citizenship. But in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, he started using the term Русский, which refers to this narrow ethnic understanding of Russianness much more often. And in his famous March 18th, 2014 speech in the wake of the annexation of Crimea, he used almost exclusively this term Ruski, referring to narrow understanding of Russianness that actually was troubling for many non-ethnic Russians within the Russian Federation. From 2015, the Kremlin has become more cautious in finding the right balance between these two terms. But it's not about the words only. It's about the essence of Russian national identity. And I see many reasons to believe that this more nativist, more narrow ethnic Russian component of Russian national identity may become stronger in the coming years. And there are many opportunities for policymakers, but a lot of challenges and threats to the unity of the Russian Federation in emphasizing this component of Russian national identity.
We have time perhaps for only one more question. I'd have to limit us to approximately a minute. So I'm going to try to incorporate two of these questions together and hope that you can give us an answer in a minute, minute and a half to a 15-minute answer. Your greatest challenge today. So the change to a Biden administration won't make much of a difference given the internal motivations affecting Russian policy. Would perhaps re-engaging Russia through shared interests, such as nuclear arms limitation treaties and so on, would this be a good way of starting some kind of reinitiation of good feelings? And I know there's a great deal to it, but if you can do that in a minute, minute and a half, we would appreciate that.
Well, the Biden administration is an opportunity to improve to an extent possible relations between Russia and the United States. But at the same time, it will be a challenge to the Kremlin. The opportunity, of course, is a different approach to arms control, and hopefully the new START treaty will be extended before February 5th, when it is set to expire. And both Moscow and Washington exchange signals that they would like to do that. There are some other opportunity in cooperation against international terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, the Biden administration will be a challenge to the Kremlin, which because the Biden administration will put much more emphasis on values in American foreign policy, including the values of democracy and freedom. This rhetoric was almost absent in American foreign policy for 4 years, and it will make its way back to American foreign policy agenda. Also, some more attention to the post-Soviet space and backing sovereignty and independence of the post-Soviet countries will be a more visible component in the Biden administration policy, and it will be also a challenge to the Kremlin. But everyone understands that we are in a new era of the relations between the two countries now.
Dr. Zevelev, thank you so much for giving us your valuable time, sharing your perspectives. We deeply appreciate it. We hope that members who could not be with us today will follow up later with viewing what you have to say. And we hope that members of the federal government as well. So thank you so much. I'll now turn you over to Dr. Robert Kennedy.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, Dr. Zevelev. It's a pleasure to have had you with us today, and we really appreciated your very thoughtful and informative comments and candid responses and to the questions that we had. You have really helped us understand better the Russian mindset and how that has been forged by the historical narratives, the Russian historical narratives, as well as the factors that tend to shape Putin's approach to contemporary Russian foreign policy. I hope we can all share your optimism. I sense that we've got a lot of barriers to overcome, not the least of which remains the problem with the breaching of international law and international agreements and the Russian occupation of the Crimea. I sense that will remain an enormous barrier to future cooperation between Russia and the United States. However, let me say again, it has been an absolute delight to have you join us today. We intend to follow this format in the future with opening the webinar with 15 minutes of interaction between participants, as well as the opportunity to see each other during the screen. So ladies and gentlemen, please join us again in the future. If you are interested in these types of topics, on the 5th of March, we will host Dmitry Trenin, the director of the Carnegie Foundation office in Moscow. And he will talk again about the Russian foreign policy and other factors that affect our relations with Russia. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for joining us today. Stay healthy and well, wear masks, get your inoculation if you can, and the very best to each and every one of you from Atlanta and ACIR. Good afternoon.